It was 1973, and I was at church camp for the first time. Now, I'd grown up going to Girl Scout camp, and I don't know what possessed my parents, but between my junior and senior year of high school, they decided it was time for church camp. It's a mystery. My family had camped, but I had never had an experience like this before at all. It was emotional, it was fascinating, I was exhilarated, it was completely different than anything I'd ever experienced. And not surprisingly, like many people before me and many people after me, at the closing campfire of that week, I gave my life to Jesus. And here we are, however many years later. I can't even count that high. What happened next was much less expected and a little less common. The following year, I went to camp again as a counselor at the age of 17, having finished high school. I was headed to UCLA to get an English degree that my father was sure would be completely useless because reading and writing skills are only good for, pastors and teachers. And I don't need to tell you who's an engineer, right? And at the campfire at that week of camp at Camp Colby, Methodist Camp Colby, in the Los Angeles Crest Highway, I got an unmistakable call to the ordained ministry, which I had to tell you startled me no end. No pastors in my family. We were garden variety churchgoers, the way you were. People just went to church. We weren't the people who had family devotions or anything like that. We weren't ever special friends with the pastor. My parents did their part as leaders in the church, so no one knew what to do with this. I went home and told my parents, and they said, "That's nice, finish college, we'll see what happens," right? Luckily, our pastor was on the camp staff, so I could talk to him that night about what had happened to me. And he was young, not too far out of seminary himself, and in his class of 50 seminarians, 2 of them had been women. So I was one of the lucky women in my generation. Nobody told me women can't be pastors. Nobody. Of course, California, right? So my parents weren't particularly happy about it, but it wasn't religion. They were just worried that I was never going to make a living. But things happen around campfires. Things happen around campfires. And today, we're going to look and see what miracle might await you at this campfire in John 21. Now, Jesus had died, and he had appeared to Mary in the garden, and then he had gone to the upper room and appeared to all the disciples except not Thomas, and then we have the story about Thomas. And then, after this, Jesus appeared again to the disciples, this time at the Tiberias Sea, the Sea of Galilee. This is how he did it. Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the brothers Zebedee, and 2 other disciples, apparently not worth describing. Simon Peter announced, "I'm going fishing." The rest of them said, "We're going with you." They went out and got in the boat. They caught nothing. And when the sun came up, Jesus was standing on the beach, but they didn't recognize him, just like Mary, a couple paragraphs before. But they will shortly. Jesus spoke to them. "Good morning. Did you catch anything for breakfast?" "No," they said. He said, "Throw the net off the right side of the boat and see what happens," which they did. And all of a sudden, there were so many fish in it, they weren't strong enough to pull it in. And then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the master." When Simon Peter realized that it was the master, he did something completely out of character and impulsive. Peter is notoriously impulsive. He threw on some clothes, for he was stripped for work, and dove into the sea. Who puts on their clothes to dive into the water? But habit. The other disciples came in by boat because they weren't far from land, 100 yards or so, pulling in the net full of fish. When they got out of the boat, they saw a fire laid with fish and bread cooking on it. Jesus can cook. Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish you've caught." And Simon Peter joined them, and they pulled the net to shore, 153 big fish. And even with all those fish, the net didn't rip. And Jesus says, breakfast is ready. He didn't really need their fish. And not one of the disciples dared ask, who are you? They knew it was the master. And then Jesus took the bread and gave it to them. And he did the same with the fish. And this was now the third time Jesus had shown himself alive to the disciples since being raised from the dead. There's a difference between a morning fire and an evening fire, isn't there? Whether you're camping or it's at home, there's just a different sense. You can still get this sense in a little place called Tabgha. It's just west of Capernaum, and that's where you can feel what it must have looked like that day. Capernaum is kind of home base for Jesus. He rented a room from Simon Peter's mother-in-law, and it is still, when the tourists have gone for the day, a pretty quiet place. It's a little bit of a distance from its nearest town, Tiberias. And the day dawns full of light and beauty as only it can on the shore of a body of water. And John draws our attention to the dawn, as he consistently does when he talks about the resurrected Christ. Now, why had they gone fishing? No one knows. It's a puzzle. I suspect it may have been a puzzle to them. You know, when you don't know what to do, you do what you always do. So they went to fish. And maybe their families said, well, okay, now that you're back from that silly adventure, maybe you could go out and make a living for us. I don't know. But Peter, who is theoretically their leader, is so ashamed of his last moments around a different fire just a few days before, around the fire, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And I suspect that it just seemed like a good idea to Peter to go someplace where no one knew him and he could hide his face. That just seems like something Peter would want to do. But as the dawn is breaking, they're stretching and shivering and feeling tired. At that moment, Jesus comes again and makes them breakfast. And Peter, who, if you think about it for just a minute, you'll realize Peter has some unfinished business with Jesus. From that fire, those 3 denials, and you can just sense the impulsiveness in Peter. I don't know if he's happy or distressed to see Jesus, but he does what his heart tells him to do, which is he jumps in the water and makes for Jesus, in spite of the fact of whatever he must have been carrying from 3 days ago. He doesn't even know what's driving him, and he probably doesn't even know it, but he's about to be given an opportunity to heal. After breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Oh, who wants to be asked this question? Nobody even wants their spouse to sit across from them at breakfast and say, do you love me? How awkward is that? Especially if you had a fight the night before, right? Yes, master, you know I love you. That's kind of weaselly, isn't it? If someone you love says, do you love me? And you say, well, you know I do. That's probably not what they were hoping to hear. And then he asks a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, master, you know I love you. And Jesus says, shepherd my sheep, feed my lambs, shepherd my sheep. I've got work for you. Here's what I want you to do. Don't go fishing. Don't go back to what you used to do. I prepared you for something new. I trained you. I gave you the Holy Spirit. Feed my sheep. Shepherd my sheep. And then Jesus says it a third time. Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was upset that he asked now for the third time. I'm not a therapist, but I do have a little experience with what it takes to heal really old wounds or really deep wounds. And that's one of the things that's going on here. John matches up. He makes sure we're hearing it. Charcoal fire at the denial courtyard, charcoal fire now. Question asked 3 times and denied, Question asked 3 times and affirmed. One time wasn't going to be enough. Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, not one. And he needed Jesus to press just a little and give him 3 opportunities, not just one, to say, I do love you, I do love you, I do love you. Because Peter's supposed to be number 1. He's the one that Jesus is building his church on. He's going to lead the rest of the disciples. And prior to this, for the last couple of days, his reputation isn't that great. And it is the 3rd time that Jesus asked this question that Peter's heart just bursts open. And he feels his upset. He's not pushing it away with, I love you. Of course I love you. Now he says, I'm heartbroken that you have to ask. But I know why you have to ask. Because 2 days ago, it didn't look very much like I loved you. I can't imagine what it felt like to be Peter. Well, actually, I can. So can you. We've all been there, where we've hurt someone we love, or we've even hurt someone we just kind of don't like very much, and we still feel bad about it. And it's hard to find healing for these things. Nothing except revisiting this kind of hurt and bathing it in God's love can heal a wound like this. What we have in this fire circle, in this story, is subtle, but it's a very powerful example of the emotional and spiritual healing that comes when we stay in relationship, when we are ready to leap out of the boat and charge towards someone we may have hurt or disappointed, or we don't know where our relationship stands, and let them say, do you love me? 3 times, because they need to hear it all those times. Healing isn't easy. It takes courage. It takes wisdom and understanding, and often it takes an outside person like a therapist who isn't invested in the emotions and the hurt to help us through it, and it takes willingness. And willingness is a product of love. It's only when we can summon up love that we are willing to do something that's embarrassing or hurtful to us, or embarrassing and sorrowing. Jesus appears miraculously, even after he's dead, to help Peter. He doesn't leave Peter wasting away with that denial. That is not his last encounter with Peter. And if you've ever had someone move away or decide not to be friends or die, and you have had unfinished business with them, and the last encounter you had with them grieves you and sorrows you, you know what's happening for Peter, and you're hearing what God is willing to do for you. What Jesus does for Peter, God is willing to do for you. You may never be able to do it in person the way Peter and Jesus could be reconciled so that Peter could be healed. But there are ways and times and places and prayers that can heal you too from things that you have been dragging around for too long. That kind of love is a miracle. You can be healed even if someone is dead. And I've lived that, which is a story for another day. So where will you find your fireside this week? Where will you be willing to heedlessly jump into the water with your clothes on in your haste to reconcile? Where will you experience heading for the side of someone you love, knowing you have business to do with them? Where will you chase after someone you've hurt for the promise of healing? Where will you sit eating grilled fish with your hands, watching the sun rise in the eyes of someone who loves you? Where will you sit around a fire, even if it's just a candle, paying attention to the show that's happening around you, eating the food given to you, and being prepared to be surprised. Things happen at campfires. You can get surprised. I hope you do.